G'day there. One of my favourite types of lenses to use for landscape photography are my wide-angle lenses. I probably shoot about half of my images using a wide-angle zoom. I find that at a wide focal length you can create dynamic compositions and images with great depth. But there are a few things that I've picked up in using a wide angle that might help you get the most out of using your wide-angle lens. And that's what we're going to cover this week. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, so if you need a website, a domain, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace and use the discount code Marr. I know it's quite trendy at the moment to use a longer focal length lens to capture an intimate and more abstract style shot of just a part of the landscape. And I've used this trick before when I might be struggling to compose the scene. I'll grab my longer lens just to hone in on just a part of the landscape to grab a more abstract style, because this style of image is more easy to compose. But a wide angle lens is a really effective tool to capture a more dynamic photo that's really enticing to look at and helps transport the viewer into the scene. Typically wide angle focal lengths are anything as wide as 24mm or maybe 20mm. For my Nikon D850 I use the 17-35. For the Nikon Z7 I've got a 14mm to 30mm lens. And for the Fuji X-T3, I use a 10 to 24mm, but that's on a crop sensor. So 10mm on a crop sensor is the equivalent of a 16mm on a full frame sensor. Focal lengths wider than 20mm are often considered ultra wide, but the tips here apply to any of these focal lengths. The obvious advantage of a wide angle is you can fit more of the scene into the frame. You can have more to the left, to the right, as well as on the top and on the bottom. The temptation though is to just crank the lens wide open and start shooting, especially when you first get your wide angle lens. But there's a few things to consider. The first is just by fitting more into the frame doesn't necessarily make it a better image, particularly if the extra elements that you're including are distracting. So it's back to basic compositional principles. Consider what you're including in the frame. Does it clutter the scene? Is it distracting? And are there still elements that are awkwardly being cut off by the edges of the frame? The advantage of the wider angle, of course, is you're able to fit those main subjects within the frame that you might not have been able to with just a standard focal length lens. But just be mindful of how the wider focal length is potentially weakening the composition in other ways. I've done a series of videos about landscape composition where I walk through the sorts of things to keep in mind when composing a scene. I'll put a link to those in the description below so you can check them out. The second thing that I consider is closely related, and it's whether the extra parts of the scene that I'm including in the frame are of any interest, and are they adding to the image? Am I enhancing the story or the flow of the scene? Again, it's back to composition basics. Say if I end up with lots of sky in the frame with not much cloud or interest, it could look a little bit odd and undermine the rest of the image. I'm not gaining much if I'm using a wide angle to just include more boring sky. If I've already taken the shot and I'm looking at it in post, really my only option is to look at cropping out that boring section. It would be better if I could make changes while I'm out in the field and angle the camera down to include more of the foreground and less of that uninteresting sky. We'll talk more about this a little later. The third thing to be aware of is the wider you go on your lens, the elements and features that are in the center of your image are going to get smaller. And this is just a consequence of the lens trying to fit more of the scene into the frame. If you find a main feature or subject of the scene in the center of your image, adjust the composition by changing the angle of the camera so the subject moves towards the edge. You don't want to put the subject right on the edge of the frame, but by placing it in the outer third, the distortion of the wide angle lens makes it seem bigger and more prominent in the image. Distortion can often be considered a negative thing, and while it can be for some styles of photography like architecture and portrait photography, distortion can be used to great effect in landscape photography. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. I mentioned before that a wide-angle lens can be used to create wonderfully dynamic images with plenty of depth, and this is generally achieved by angling the camera down. By turning the camera towards the ground, I'm capturing more of what's directly in front of the camera, emphasizing the foreground and creating the feeling for the viewer that they're actually standing in the scene. If I want to make even more of the elements in the foreground, I can get closer by just lowering the camera closer to the ground. But sometimes I find that this is not always a good move because it tends to flatten out the rest of the scene. This is often the case with flatter scenes like seascapes. With a standard focal length, you might not have much choice. To get much of the foreground in the frame, you need to get the camera low to the ground. One of the real advantages of a wide or ultra-wide lens is that you can get a really strong foreground without having to lower the camera and sacrifice the midground of your scene. I mentioned this next tip in a previous video I did about seascapes. Turning the camera around to portrait mode with a wide angle lens and tilting it down allows you to capture even more of the foreground, almost to the point where you're including some of the ground that's right underneath the lens. This is a great option when I feel the scene to the right and to the left of the frame really isn't adding much to the image or the story. As with these other tips, using portrait mode with a wide angle adds depth by including elements close to the camera as well as in the midground and the background of the scene. Next, I'm going to cover some of the things that you can do to get the most out of the distortion of a wide angle lens. But first, I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. When you're starting a website for your photography, you're probably looking at including some simple features like a dynamic landing page to catch the interest of viewers, an image gallery where you can share your photos, and perhaps an About Me page to tell people a little bit about yourself. Squarespace does all of this in a really simple and easy way to set up. In fact, you can have a website like this set up in just a matter of an hour or two, even if you don't yet have a domain. But one of the great things about Squarespace is as your photography grows, you can add more complex features just as easily to your website, like integration with your social media accounts, or you can add a blogging section so you can share more than just your images. It has embedded SEO so you can start drawing views to your site, plus a contacts page so people can get in touch. When you're ready to sell prints, you can incorporate an online store that integrates with payment gateways, making the process much easier to set up and manage. All of this can be monitored through the analytics that they provide right across your site, and none of this requires any code, which is perfect for me. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial that'll give you heaps of time to set up a website, and then when you're ready to launch, make sure you go to squarespace.com/Andrew Marr to get 10% off your first purchase. Earlier I was talking about how you can use the distortion of a wide angle lens to make some objects more prominent in your image. Another way of leveraging distortion is to create leading lines in your image to draw the viewer into the scene. In this example, I was capturing the patterns created by the water running out to the ocean. There wasn't much happening in the sky, so I angled the camera down to pick up more of the patterns in the sand. Those patterns run straight out to the sea. However, captured with a wide angle lens, not only was I able to capture more of the patterns, but the lines started to converge towards the center of the image. This, combined with the light and the texture, I was able to create a stronger foreground with lines that encourage the viewer's eye into the rest of the scene. I've used a similar approach with the sky, as once again, the wide angle lens distorts the clouds and creates converging lines that directs the eye to other parts of the photo. The obvious advantage to using a wide angle is you can capture big vistas. But I think the real benefit of a wide angle lens for landscape photography is it allows me to step right into a scene, so I'm close up to a subject, and with a wide focal length, I'm still able to capture other elements around the main subject. This approach means that I can get up and close to the action or the feature, picking up on all the details, the patterns and the textures that make up the landscape. This increases the amount of interest that you include in your photo and makes for a better landscape image. Another option is to take one or two steps back from your subject and with a wide angle lens include some other elements within the scene. Framing the scene with some other elements adds context to the main subject and enhances the story you're telling. This works in a similar way to the foreground I talked about earlier. Framing with, say, some rocks or trees is a way of including other elements in a way that isn't distracting but instead supports the main subject, adds depth, and can improve the image as it directs the viewer's eye to the main feature. One of the benefits that I've mentioned of a wide-angle lens is how you can create depth within an image with some elements close to the camera in the foreground and other features further away. To have all of these elements in focus throughout the scene, I'll usually set my aperture to f11 or smaller to f16 to give me a large depth of field. In situations where I can't set a depth of field that's large enough, I'll need to focus stack the scene with a series of shots focused on elements at different distances from the camera. Focus stacking is fairly easy to do out in the field, and the images can be merged together in Photoshop. I've done a video explaining how to focus stack a scene and how to merge the images together both automatically and manually in Photoshop. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check that video out. No matter how long you've been doing landscape photography, I think a wide-angle lens is definitely a handy lens to have in your camera bag. I hope these tips were helpful. If they were, please give the video a like. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.